The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of the Kentucky Historical Society archives in Frankfort, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the quiet work being conducted inside the climate-controlled research room on the third floor. Dr. James Whitmore had spent the better part of 2 decades as a photographic historian, specializing in 19th-century American frontier life, and his expertise had made him one of the most sought-after consultants for museums and historical societies across the Midwest. His work involved the painstaking examination of old photographs using modern digital technology, a process that often revealed details invisible to the naked eye and transformed our understanding of historical events and daily life in earlier eras. James took particular satisfaction in his ability to extract information from damaged or faded images, using sophisticated software to enhance contrast, adjust exposure, and bring clarity to photographs that had been deteriorating for more than a century. The Kentucky Historical Society had hired him to examine and digitize a collection of frontier photographs that had been donated by the descendants of early settlers, and James had been working through the materials methodically for the past 3 weeks. The collection consisted of approximately 200 photographs dating from the 1870s through the early 1900s, most of them showing families, homesteads, and scenes of rural life in the mountainous regions of eastern Kentucky. James had developed a systematic approach to processing such collections, beginning with a visual inspection of each photograph to assess its condition and historical significance, followed by high-resolution scanning and digital enhancement to reveal details that might not be apparent in the original prints. He worked alone in the archives, preferring the solitude that allowed him to focus completely on the images and the stories they contained. His desk was equipped with multiple monitors, a professional-grade scanner, and specialized lighting equipment that could illuminate photographs from various angles to reveal texture and depth. A large magnifying glass mounted on an adjustable arm allowed him to examine fine details without touching the fragile originals, and he kept meticulous notes about each image in a digital database. That would eventually become part of the Historical Society's permanent records. Most of the photographs James had examined so far were fairly typical examples of frontier photography, showing the kinds of scenes that appeared in countless similar collections across the country. There were formal family portraits taken in front of log cabins, images of children playing in dusty yards, photographs of men with hunting rifles standing beside their kills, and women posed with their domestic tools and animals. The technical quality varied considerably, as many of the photographs had been taken by itinerant photographers who traveled through remote areas, offering their services to families who might only have their pictures taken once or twice in their entire lives. Some images were sharp and well composed, while others were blurred or poorly exposed, the subjects often appearing as ghostly figures due to movement during the long exposure times required by early cameras. James had learned to read these photographs not just for their obvious content, but for the subtle details that revealed information about social relationships, economic conditions, and cultural practices that written records often failed to capture. On this particular afternoon, James was working through a group of photographs that had come from a family named Hutchinson, who had settled in Pike County in the eastern mountains during the 1880s. The Hutchinson collection included about 30 images spanning 2 generations, and James had been impressed by their generally good condition and the care with which they had obviously been preserved over the decades. He had already scanned and catalogued most of the collection, and he was now working on the final few images, including a large format photograph that showed the Hutchinson family cabin in considerable detail. The photograph measured approximately 8 by 10 inches and had been mounted on heavy cardboard backing, suggesting that it had been considered an important image worth special preservation. The cabin itself was a substantial 2-room structure built of hewn logs with a stone foundation and a wooden shingle roof, more prosperous looking than many of the crude shelters that appeared in other photographs from the same period and region. James placed the photograph on his scanner and began the digitization process, watching as the scanning head moved slowly across the image and captured it at a resolution of 1200 dots per inch, far higher than necessary for most purposes, but essential for revealing fine details that might be significant. When the scan was complete, he opened the resulting file in his image editing software and began his standard enhancement process, adjusting the levels and curves to bring out details in the shadows and highlights. As the image appeared on his monitor at high magnification, James began his usual systematic examination, starting at the top left corner and working his way across and down the image, looking for interesting details or anomalies that might warrant further investigation. He noted the construction details of the cabin, the tools and equipment visible in the yard, the clothing worn by the family members who stood in front of the building, and the various other elements that would help him write a detailed description for the archives. But as his eyes moved across the lower right portion of the image, focusing on the area near the cabin's front door, James noticed something that made him pause and lean closer to his monitor, his professional curiosity suddenly aroused by a detail that seemed out of place and potentially significant. There was a dark stain on the wooden planks of the cabin's front porch, clearly visible in the enhanced digital image, but subtle enough that it might easily be overlooked in a casual examination of the original photograph. The stain appeared to be roughly circular or oval in shape, measuring perhaps 2 or 3 feet in diameter, and it was noticeably darker than the surrounding wood, suggesting that it had soaked into the planks rather than simply resting on the surface. James increased the magnification further, zooming in until the stain filled most of his monitor, and he began applying various enhancement techniques to better understand its nature and characteristics. He adjusted the contrast to emphasize the tonal differences between the stain and the surrounding wood, and he used edge detection filters to define its boundaries more clearly. The more he examined the stain, the more convinced he became that it represented something significant, though he could not yet determine what that might be. What made the stain particularly intriguing was its location and the apparent reaction of the family members in the photograph. The Hutchinson family consisted of 7 people arranged in a careful composition in front of their cabin, and James now noticed that their positioning seemed deliberately designed to draw attention away from the area where the stain was located. The family members stood in a tight group on the left side of the porch, leaving the right side conspicuously empty, except for the stained area. Their body language suggested a certain tension or discomfort, with several of them appearing to avoid looking directly at the camera, and one woman who stood at the edge of the group seemed to be deliberately angling her body to block the view of something. James had examined thousands of frontier photographs over his career, and he had developed an instinct for reading the subtle cues that indicated when something unusual or significant was happening beyond the obvious subject matter of the image. He turned his attention to the metadata and documentation that had accompanied the photograph, hoping to find some explanation for what he was seeing. The photograph had been labeled with a date of May 1895 and identified as showing the Hutchinson family at their home in Pike County, but there was no additional information about the circumstances under which it had been taken or any events that might have been occurring at the time. James pulled up the other photographs from the Hutchinson collection and began comparing them, looking for patterns or changes that might provide context. He found several earlier photographs showing the same cabin, taken in what appeared to be 1893 and 1894, based on the apparent ages of the children, and in those images the porch appeared clean and unstained. The stain, whatever it was, had appeared sometime between the earlier photographs and the May 1895 image, and it had been significant enough that the family had not removed or concealed it before having their portrait taken. James spent the next hour conducting various technical analyses of the stain, using the sophisticated tools available in his image editing software to extract every possible piece of information from the pixels that composed that portion of the photograph. He examined the texture and pattern of the stain, looking for clues about what substance might have created it. He analyzed the way light reflected from the stained area compared to the surrounding wood, trying to determine whether the stain was raised above the surface or had penetrated into the wood grain. He compared the color values in the stain to other dark areas in the photograph, looking for similarities or differences that might indicate the stain's composition. The more he analyzed the image, the more certain he became that the stain was not simply dirt or weathering, but rather the result of some liquid that had been spilled or pooled on the porch and had soaked deeply into the wood. The implications of this observation troubled James in ways he could not quite articulate, and he found himself reluctant to voice the suspicion that was forming in his mind. He had seen enough frontier photographs to know that life in remote mountain settlements during the 1890s had been harsh and often violent, and that many families had experienced tragedies that were never fully documented in official records. The dark stain on the Hutchinson porch could have innocent explanations, perhaps the result of butchering an animal, or some accident involving lamp oil or other household substances. But the size and location of the stain, combined with the family's obvious discomfort in the photograph and their apparent effort to position themselves away from it, suggested something more disturbing. James made the decision to investigate further, recognizing that he might be opening a door to a story that the Hutchinson family had chosen not to tell and that their descendants might prefer to keep buried in the past. James began his investigation by searching through the Historical Society's archives for any additional materials related to the Hutchinson family, hoping to find letters, diaries, legal documents, or newspaper articles that might shed light on events in Pike County during the spring of 1895. The archives contained extensive collections of materials related to Eastern Kentucky history, and James spent the remainder of that afternoon and most of the next day working through boxes of documents, reading through faded handwriting and brittle newspaper pages, looking for any mention of the Hutchinson name or events that might be connected to what he had observed in the photograph. The work was tedious and often frustrating, as the indexing and organization of historical materials was incomplete, and he had to examine many documents that proved irrelevant to his search. But James had learned patience during his years of historical research, and he understood that significant discoveries often required sifting through vast amounts of mundane information to find the few crucial pieces that illuminated a larger story. His persistence was rewarded late on the second day when he discovered a brief article in the Pike County News dated April 18, 1895, just a few weeks before the photograph had been taken. The article reported that a man named Daniel Hutchinson, aged 23, had died at his family's home under what the newspaper described as tragic and unexpected circumstances. The article provided few details about the nature of Daniel's death, stating only that he had been found deceased on the morning of April 16th and that the family was grieving the loss of a beloved son and brother. A follow-up article published a week later mentioned that Daniel Hutchinson had been buried in the family cemetery on their property and that the community had rallied to support the bereaved family. James noted the dates carefully, realizing that Daniel's death had occurred approximately 3 weeks before the family portrait was taken, and he began to wonder whether there might be a connection between that death and the stain visible on the cabin porch. He expanded his search to include court records and official documents from Pike County, requesting access to coroner's reports, death certificates, and any legal proceedings that might have involved the Hutchinson family during 1895. The Historical Society's archivist, a helpful woman named Margaret Chen, who had worked there for more than 30 years, assisted James in locating the relevant materials and arranging access to documents that were stored in restricted collections. Margaret mentioned that she had processed the Hutchinson photograph collection when it had been donated several years earlier, and she recalled that the donor, a great-granddaughter of the family, had mentioned that there had been some kind of tragedy in the family's history, but had not provided specific details. Margaret said that such reticence was common among descendants of frontier families, many of whom preferred not to discuss difficult or painful aspects of their ancestors' lives, and she encouraged James to be sensitive in his investigation and to consider the feelings of living family members who might be affected by whatever he discovered. James found the death certificate for Daniel Hutchinson filed with the Pike County Clerk's office, and the document provided information that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The certificate listed the cause of death as accidental gunshot wound, and it indicated that Daniel had died at his family's residence on April 16, 1895. The certificate had been signed by a local physician named Dr. Samuel Morrison, who had apparently examined the body and made the determination about the cause of death. But there was no coroner's inquest report, which James found unusual given that accidental deaths, particularly those involving firearms, typically warranted some official investigation to rule out foul play or suicide. The absence of such documentation suggested either that the death had been accepted at face value without much scrutiny, or that any investigation that had been conducted had not been preserved in the official records. James requested access to Dr. Morrison's personal papers, hoping that the physician might have kept notes or correspondence related to Daniel Hutchinson's death that would provide more detail than the sparse official record. The Historical Society held a small collection of Morrison's papers, donated by his descendants in the 1970s, and James spent several hours working through boxes of medical records, personal correspondence, and miscellaneous documents. He found several references to the Hutchinson family in Morrison's records, including notes about treating various family members for common ailments and injuries over a period of several years, but he found nothing specific about Daniel's death until he discovered a letter that Morrison had written to a colleague in Lexington, dated April 20th, 1895, just 4 days after Daniel had died. In the letter, Morrison mentioned that he had recently been called to examine a young man who had died from a gunshot wound, and he expressed some concern about the circumstances of the death, though he did not elaborate on what specifically troubled him. Morrison wrote that the family had been adamant that the death was accidental and had discouraged any extensive investigation, and that he had ultimately accepted their account and signed the death certificate accordingly, though he admitted to his colleague that he had some lingering doubts about whether the full truth had been told. The discovery of Dr. Morrison's letter convinced James that there was indeed a significant story behind the stain on the Hutchinson cabin porch, and that the story involved Daniel Hutchinson's death in ways that the family had chosen not to disclose publicly. James understood that he was now facing an ethical dilemma that was common in historical research: the tension between the pursuit of historical truth and the obligation to respect the privacy and dignity of the people whose lives were being investigated. He spent a restless night considering how to proceed, weighing his professional responsibility to document and interpret historical evidence against his awareness that his investigation might uncover information that would be painful or embarrassing to the Hutchinson family's living descendants. By morning, he had decided that he needed to contact those descendants and inform them of what he had discovered, giving them an opportunity to provide their perspective and to participate in decisions about how the information should be handled. Margaret Chen helped James locate contact information for the woman who had donated the Hutchinson photograph collection, a retired schoolteacher named Linda Hutchinson Brennan, who lived in Lexington. James called Linda and explained that he was working with the photographs her family had donated and that he had discovered some details that raised questions about events in 1895. Linda was initially hesitant to discuss family history with a stranger, but when James described the stain visible in the cabin photograph and mentioned Daniel Hutchinson's death, she fell silent for a long moment before asking if they could meet in person to discuss the matter. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Lexington the following Saturday, and James spent the intervening days preparing materials to share with Linda, including enhanced images of the photograph and copies of the documents he had found in the archives. When they met, Linda proved to be a woman in her early 70s with a direct manner and intelligent eyes that suggested she would not be easily deceived or manipulated. James showed her the enhanced photograph and pointed out the stain on the cabin porch, and he watched as her expression shifted from curiosity to recognition to something that looked like resignation. Linda told James that she had known about the stain and about Daniel Hutchinson's death, though the details had been passed down through family stories rather than documented in any written records that she had seen. According to the family narrative that Linda had heard from her grandmother, Daniel had not died from an accidental gunshot wound, as the official records claimed, but had rather been murdered by a man named Thomas Slater, who had been involved in a dispute with the Hutchinson family over a boundary line between their properties. The dispute had escalated over several months, with both families making threats and accusations, and it had culminated in a confrontation on the Hutchinson cabin porch, during which Slater had shot Daniel and killed him. Linda explained that the Hutchinson family had faced a difficult decision in the aftermath of Daniel's death, as they lived in a remote area where law enforcement was minimal and justice was often administered through personal vengeance rather than legal processes. The family had known that if they reported Daniel's death as murder and accused Thomas Slater, the result would likely be a blood feud that could last for generations and claim many more lives on both sides. They had also known that Slater came from a large and well-connected family that had considerable influence in the county, and that any legal proceedings would likely favor Slater over the Hutchinsons, who were relative newcomers to the area. After much anguished discussion, the family had decided to accept a private settlement in which Slater acknowledged responsibility for Daniel's death and agreed to pay compensation to the family, and in exchange the Hutchinsons agreed to report the death as accidental and to pursue no further action against Slater. Dr. Morrison had been brought into the arrangement and had agreed to sign a death certificate listing the cause as accidental, though his letter to his colleague suggested that he had been uncomfortable with the deception. The stain on the cabin porch, Linda told James, was Daniel's blood, which had pooled on the wooden planks where he had fallen after being shot, and which had soaked so deeply into the wood that it could not be removed despite the family's efforts to scrub it away. The family had considered replacing the stained boards before having their portrait taken in May 1895, but they had ultimately decided to leave the stain visible as a private memorial to Daniel and as a reminder of the price they had paid for peace with the Slater family. Linda said that her grandmother had told her that the family members in the photograph had positioned themselves deliberately to avoid standing on or near the stain, as they considered it sacred ground that should not be walked upon. The photograph had been taken at the insistence of Daniel's mother, who had wanted to document the family as it existed after Daniel's death, and who had insisted that the stain be visible in the image, even though it would raise questions that the family would refuse to answer. James listened to Linda's account with a mixture of fascination and sorrow, recognizing that he had uncovered a story that illuminated the harsh realities of frontier justice and the impossible choices that families sometimes faced when formal legal systems were inadequate or inaccessible. He asked Linda how she felt about the possibility of making this information public, and whether she believed that her family's story should be shared with historians and the general public, or kept private, as her ancestors had intended. Linda considered the question carefully before responding that she believed the time had come for the truth to be told, that enough generations had passed, that the story no longer posed any danger to living family members, and that Daniel Hutchinson deserved to be remembered as a murder victim, rather than as someone who had died in a careless accident. She told James that she would cooperate with his research and would provide access to family documents and stories that had been preserved privately, on the condition that he treat the story with respect and sensitivity, and that he acknowledge the difficult circumstances that had led her ancestors to conceal the truth. Over the following weeks, James worked closely with Linda to piece together a comprehensive account of Daniel Hutchinson's death and its aftermath. Linda provided him with letters and diary entries that had been kept by various family members, including a particularly detailed account written by Daniel's sister Martha, who had been present in the cabin when the shooting occurred, and who had witnessed the entire confrontation between Daniel and Thomas Slater. Martha's account described how Slater had arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon of April 16, 1895, demanding to speak with Daniel about the boundary dispute. Daniel had gone out onto the porch to talk with Slater, and Martha had watched from inside the cabin as the conversation became heated and then violent. According to Martha's account, Slater had drawn a pistol and shot Daniel in the chest at close range, and Daniel had collapsed on the porch and died within minutes, while his family watched helplessly. Martha wrote that the sound of the gunshot and the sight of her brother's blood spreading across the porch boards had haunted her for the rest of her life. Linda also shared family stories about the negotiations that had followed Daniel's death, describing how her great-great-grandfather Thomas Hutchinson had met with Thomas Slater and members of the Slater family to arrange the settlement that would allow both families to avoid a prolonged and destructive feud. The settlement had included a payment of $500 to the Hutchinson family, a substantial sum at the time, as well as an agreement that the Slater family would cede their claim to the disputed boundary land. In exchange, the Hutchinsons had agreed to the fiction that Daniel's death had been accidental, and both families had agreed to maintain peaceful relations going forward. The arrangement had held for many years, and the two families had eventually intermarried and become connected through multiple kinship ties, though the memory of Daniel's death had remained a source of tension and sadness that was rarely discussed openly. James began writing a detailed research paper that would document his findings and place the Hutchinson case in the broader context of frontier justice and conflict resolution in late 19th century Appalachia. He consulted with other historians who specialized in the period and region, and he discovered that the Hutchinson case was far from unique, that many families in remote areas had faced similar situations where formal legal systems were inadequate and where private settlements and accommodations were necessary to prevent cycles of violence. His research revealed that the practice of concealing murders as accidents or suicides had been relatively common in frontier communities, and that many death certificates and official records from the period were unreliable because they reflected negotiated fictions rather than factual accounts. James argued in his paper that historians needed to look beyond official documents and to examine photographs, family stories, and other alternative sources of information if they wanted to understand the true nature of life and death in frontier America. As James prepared to present his findings to the historical community, he remained acutely aware of the human dimensions of the story he was telling. The stain on the Hutchinson cabin porch was not simply an interesting historical detail or a puzzle to be solved, but rather a marker of genuine tragedy and loss, a place where a young man had died violently and where his family had been forced to make agonizing choices about how to respond. James included in his paper a photograph of Daniel Hutchinson that Linda had provided, showing a serious young man with dark hair and intense eyes, and he wrote about Daniel not as an abstract historical figure, but as a real person whose life had been cut short and whose death had reverberated through generations of his family. James hoped that by telling Daniel's story with honesty and compassion, he could honor both the truth and the memory of the people whose lives had been shaped by events that occurred on that April day in 1895. James presented his research at the annual conference of the American Historical Association in Chicago, delivering a paper titled Blood on the Boards: Photography, Memory, and Frontier Justice in 19th Century Kentucky to an audience of more than 200 historians and scholars. He had prepared a multimedia presentation that included the enhanced photograph of the Hutchinson cabin with the stain clearly visible, as well as images of the documents he had discovered and excerpts from Martha Hutchinson's eyewitness account of her brother's death. The presentation walked the audience through his investigative process, showing how careful examination of photographic evidence combined with archival research and family oral histories could reveal truths that official records had been designed to conceal. James emphasized the ethical dimensions of his work, discussing how he had navigated the tension between historical inquiry and respect for family privacy, and how he had worked collaboratively with Linda Hutchinson Brennan to ensure that the story was told in a way that honored her ancestors while contributing to scholarly understanding of frontier life. The response to James's presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with many scholars expressing admiration for his methodological approach and his sensitive handling of difficult material. Several historians approached him after the session to discuss similar cases they had encountered in their own research, where photographic evidence had revealed information that contradicted or complicated official narratives. One scholar from West Virginia described finding a photograph that showed a lynching victim's body in the background of what appeared to be a casual street scene, suggesting that such violence had been so normalized in some communities that it was barely worth noting. Another researcher from Tennessee discussed discovering photographs of prison labor camps that documented brutal conditions that state officials had denied existed. These conversations reinforced James's belief that photographs were invaluable historical sources that deserved more systematic and critical analysis than they typically received, and that the application of modern digital enhancement techniques could transform our understanding of the past by revealing details that previous generations of historians had been unable to see. The presentation also generated some controversy and criticism, particularly from scholars who questioned whether James had been right to publicize information that the Hutchinson family had deliberately kept private for more than a century. One historian argued that James had violated the family's autonomy and their right to control their own narrative, and that his research represented a form of historical voyeurism that prioritized scholarly curiosity over human dignity. Another critic suggested that by focusing on violence and tragedy, James was perpetuating negative stereotypes about Appalachian communities and ignoring the many positive aspects of frontier life that deserved equal attention. James responded to these criticisms by emphasizing that he had worked closely with family descendants throughout his research and had received their explicit permission and cooperation in making the story public. He also argued that historians had a responsibility to document difficult truths, even when those truths were uncomfortable, and that sanitizing the past by ignoring violence and injustice served no one's interests in the long run. Linda Hutchinson Brennan had traveled to Chicago to attend James's presentation, and she participated in the question and answer session that followed, offering her perspective as a family descendant on why she had chosen to support James's research and publication of the story. Linda told the audience that she had struggled with the decision for many weeks before agreeing to cooperate with James, and that she had consulted with other family members to gauge their feelings about making the story public. She explained that most of her relatives had supported the decision, believing that Daniel Hutchinson deserved to be remembered truthfully and that the family had nothing to be ashamed of in how they had handled an impossible situation. Linda said that she hoped the story would help people understand the complex moral landscape of frontier life, where formal legal systems were often absent or corrupt, and where families had to make difficult choices about how to pursue justice and maintain peace. She concluded by saying that she was grateful to James for treating her family's story with respect and for helping to ensure that Daniel would not be forgotten. The presentation and the subsequent discussions generated significant media interest, with several journalists attending the conference and writing articles about James's research for major publications. The coverage brought widespread attention to the Hutchinson case and sparked broader conversations about the reliability of historical records and the importance of examining multiple sources of evidence when reconstructing past events. James found himself fielding interview requests from radio programs and podcasts, and he was invited to give talks at universities and historical societies across the country. The Kentucky Historical Society reported a surge in visitors wanting to see the Hutchinson photograph collection, and the Society's director contacted James about developing a special exhibition that would showcase his research and explore the broader themes of frontier justice and photographic evidence. James agreed to curate the exhibition, recognizing that it would provide an opportunity to reach a much wider audience than his academic publications could achieve, and to engage the public in important conversations about how we understand and interpret the past. The exhibition opened at the Kentucky Historical Society 6 months later under the title Stains of History, Violence, Memory and Truth in Frontier Photography, and it attracted unprecedented crowds. From the moment the IC doors opened, James had worked with a team of exhibition designers to create an immersive experience that guided visitors through the process of historical investigation, beginning with the original Hutchinson cabin photograph displayed without enhancement and inviting visitors to examine it closely before revealing the digitally enhanced version that made the stain clearly visible. The exhibition then presented the documents and evidence that James had uncovered, including reproductions of Martha Hutchinson's eyewitness account, Dr. Morrison's letter expressing his doubts about the official story, and the settlement agreement between the Hutchinson and Slater families. Interactive displays allowed visitors to experiment with digital enhancement techniques themselves, using touchscreens to adjust contrast and brightness on other historical photographs and discover hidden details. The exhibition also included a section devoted to the ethical questions raised by James's research, presenting multiple perspectives on whether historians should publicize information that families had chosen to keep private. The public response to the exhibition was intense and varied, with visitors expressing a wide range of emotional reactions to the story and the questions it raised. Many people were moved by Daniel Hutchinson's story and expressed admiration for the family's difficult decision to pursue peace rather than vengeance. Others were troubled by the revelation that official records could not be trusted and that many accepted historical narratives might be concealing similar truths. The exhibition's guest book, filled with comments from visitors who shared their own family stories of violence, injustice, and difficult choices, and James was struck by how many people felt a personal connection to the themes explored in the exhibition. Several visitors mentioned that they had ancestors who had died under suspicious circumstances that were never fully explained, and that they wondered whether their own family photographs might contain hidden evidence of what had really happened. The exhibition sparked conversations about the nature of historical truth and the responsibilities of historians, and it demonstrated that academic research could resonate deeply with general audiences when presented in accessible and engaging ways. However, the exhibition also generated criticism and controversy from some quarters, particularly from descendants of the Slater family, who felt that James's research had unfairly vilified their ancestor Thomas Slater and presented a one-sided account of the conflict between the two families. A group of Slater descendants contacted the Historical Society to complain that the exhibition portrayed Thomas Slater as a murderer without acknowledging that the boundary dispute had been complex and that both families had engaged in provocative behavior. They argued that the Hutchinson family's account might not be entirely accurate, and that Thomas Slater's perspective had been lost because his family had honored the agreement to remain silent about the incident. The Slater descendants requested that the exhibition be modified to present a more balanced view of the conflict, and they offered to provide family documents that they claimed would show that Thomas Slater had acted in self-defense rather than committing murder. The Historical Society's board convened a special meeting to consider the complaint and to decide how to respond to the Slater family's concerns. James participated in the board meeting and listened carefully to the arguments presented by the Slater family representatives, who included a lawyer and a retired history professor who had researched their family's genealogy. They presented letters and documents that portrayed Thomas Slater as a respected member of his community who had been involved in a tragic accident rather than a deliberate killing. They argued that the settlement agreement between the families had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of public accusation that James's research had now made, and that reopening the case after more than a century violated the spirit of that agreement. James responded by pointing out that his research was based on eyewitness testimony from Martha Hutchinson and on Dr. Morrison's contemporaneous doubts about the official story, and that the Slater family's documents did not contradict the essential facts of what had happened. He acknowledged that historical truth was often complex and that different families might remember events differently, but he maintained that the evidence supported the conclusion that Daniel Hutchinson had been murdered and that the official record had been falsified to conceal that fact. After lengthy deliberation, the Historical Society's board decided to add a supplementary panel to the exhibition that would acknowledge the Slater family's perspective and present some of the documents they had provided, while maintaining the overall narrative that James had constructed based on his research. The board also organized a public forum where representatives of both families could present their views and where historians and community members could discuss the challenges of reconstructing historical events when different sources provide conflicting accounts. The forum took place on a Saturday afternoon and attracted more than 300 people, filling the Historical Society's auditorium to capacity. Linda Hutchinson Brennan and several Slater descendants participated in a panel discussion moderated by James, and while the conversation was sometimes tense and emotional, it ultimately demonstrated that historical inquiry could accommodate multiple perspectives while still pursuing truth. The forum concluded with a general agreement that both families had been victims of circumstances that made violence seem inevitable, and that the real lesson of the story was the importance of building legal and social systems that could resolve conflicts without bloodshed. In the months following the forum, James observed a gradual shift in how both families and the broader public understood the Hutchinson-Slater conflict, moving from a simple narrative of murder and cover-up to a more nuanced appreciation of the impossible choices that frontier families faced when formal justice systems were inadequate or absent. The Historical Society reported that visitors to the exhibition spent increasing amounts of time reading the supplementary materials that presented the Slater family's perspective, and that many people commented on how the story illustrated the tragic consequences of social conditions that forced ordinary people into violent confrontations. James received letters from descendants of both families thanking him for creating a space where their ancestors' stories could be told and discussed openly, and several people mentioned that the exhibition and forum had helped to heal old wounds and to bring the two families together in ways that had not been possible when the events were still shrouded in secrecy and shame. The success of the exhibition led to invitations for James to consult on similar projects at other institutions, and he found himself traveling frequently to museums and historical societies that wanted help examining their photographic collections for hidden details that might reveal new information about the past. He worked with a museum in Virginia to analyze photographs of a coal mining community and discovered evidence of child labor that company records had denied existed. He assisted a historical society in Tennessee in examining photographs of a tuberculosis sanatorium and found images that documented experimental treatments that had never been officially recorded. He helped a university archive in North Carolina analyze photographs of a Native American boarding school and uncovered visual evidence of abuse and neglect that survivors had described in oral histories, but that administrators had always denied. Each project reinforced James's conviction that photographs were among the most valuable and underutilized sources for historical research, and that modern digital technology had created unprecedented opportunities to extract information from images that had been hiding in plain sight for generations. James also began teaching workshops and seminars on photographic analysis for historians, archivists, and museum professionals, sharing the techniques and methods he had developed over his career. He emphasized that successful photographic analysis required not just technical skills with image enhancement software, but also careful attention to historical context, willingness to pursue multiple lines of evidence, and sensitivity to the ethical implications of revealing information that people had chosen to conceal. He taught his students to look beyond the obvious subjects of photographs and to examine backgrounds, shadows, reflections, and other details that might provide important information. He encouraged them to compare multiple photographs of the same locations or people taken at different times, looking for changes or anomalies that might indicate significant events. He stressed the importance of combining photographic evidence with documentary research and oral histories to build comprehensive and reliable accounts of past events. The Kentucky Historical Society decided to make the Stains of History exhibition a permanent installation, recognizing that it had become one of their most popular and impactful displays, and that it continued to generate important conversations about historical truth and memory. The Society also established a digital archive where researchers could access high-resolution scans of photographs from their collections and could submit their own analyses and discoveries for peer review and publication. James served on the advisory board for the Digital Archive Project, helping to develop standards and protocols for photographic analysis and ensuring that the archive would be accessible to both professional historians and interested members of the public. The archive quickly became a valuable resource for researchers across the country, and it facilitated numerous discoveries of hidden details in historical photographs that led to new publications and exhibitions. As James reflected on the impact of his research on the Hutchinson cabin photograph, he recognized that the project had transformed not just his own understanding of frontier history, but also the broader field's appreciation for the complexity and richness of photographic sources. The stain on the Hutchinson porch had been visible in the photograph for more than a century, but it had taken modern technology and a willingness to ask difficult questions to reveal what it represented and to understand its significance. James believed that countless other photographs in archives and collections around the world contained similar hidden details waiting to be discovered, and that each discovery had the potential to challenge accepted narratives and to reveal truths that had been deliberately or accidentally concealed. He felt privileged to have played a role in developing and promoting the methods that would enable future generations of historians to unlock those secrets and to build a more complete and honest understanding of the past. 3 years after the opening of the Stains of History exhibition, James received an unexpected package in the mail from an elderly man named Robert Slater, who identified himself as the great-great-grandson of Thomas Slater. The package contained a leather-bound journal that Robert explained had been kept by his ancestor and had been passed down through the family for generations, though its contents had never been shared outside the immediate family. Robert wrote in an accompanying letter that he had visited the exhibition at the Kentucky Historical Society and had been deeply moved by the forum discussion and by the effort to present both families' perspectives with honesty and respect. He said that after much consideration and discussion with other family members, he had decided that the time had come to share Thomas Slater's own account of the events of April 1895, and that he trusted James to handle the material responsibly and to incorporate it into the historical record in a way that would serve the truth rather than simply defending one family's reputation at the expense of the other. James opened the journal with trembling hands, aware that he might be about to read words that would fundamentally change his understanding of the Hutchinson-Slater conflict. The journal entries from early 1895 described Thomas Slater's growing frustration with the boundary dispute and his belief that the Hutchinson family was deliberately encroaching on land that rightfully belonged to the Slaters. Thomas wrote about several confrontations with Daniel Hutchinson over the disputed boundary, and he described Daniel as hot-tempered and unwilling to compromise. But the entry for April 16, 1895, told a story that was more complex and more tragic than either family's previous accounts had suggested. According to Thomas's own words, He had gone to the Hutchinson cabin that day, intending to propose a peaceful resolution to the dispute, offering to have the boundary surveyed by a neutral third party whose decision both families would accept. He had found Daniel on the porch, and their conversation had indeed become heated. But Thomas insisted that he had not drawn his pistol with the intention of shooting Daniel. Thomas's account described how Daniel had suddenly lunged at him during their argument, and how Thomas had instinctively drawn his pistol to defend himself. In the struggle that followed, the gun had discharged, and Daniel had been shot in the chest. Thomas wrote that he had been horrified by what had happened and had immediately tried to help Daniel, but the wound had been fatal, and Daniel had died within minutes. Thomas described his anguish and guilt over having killed a man, even accidentally, and his fear of what would happen when the authorities investigated the death. He wrote that the Hutchinson family had been devastated and enraged, and that he had expected them to seek vengeance or to have him arrested and tried for murder. But instead, after several tense days of negotiation, mediated by community elders, the two families had reached the settlement that allowed both sides to avoid further violence and to maintain their positions in the community. Thomas wrote that he had agreed to pay compensation and to accept responsibility for Daniel's death, and that he had lived with the guilt and sorrow of that day for the rest of his life. James read through the entire journal carefully, taking notes and comparing Thomas Slater's account with the other evidence he had gathered over the years. The journal entries were consistent with the known facts and did not contradict Martha Hutchinson's eyewitness testimony in any fundamental way, though they provided Thomas's perspective on his own intentions and state of mind. James recognized that Thomas's claim that the shooting had been accidental during a struggle rather than a deliberate murder was impossible to verify or disprove at this distance in time, and that both accounts might contain elements of truth, shaped by each person's perspective and emotional investment in the events. What seemed clear was that a tragic confrontation had occurred on the Hutchinson cabin porch, that Daniel Hutchinson had died there, and that both families had chosen to conceal the full truth in order to prevent further bloodshed and to allow both sides to continue living in the same community. James contacted Linda Hutchinson Brennan to inform her about the journal and to discuss how this new information should be incorporated into the historical record. Linda read the relevant passages and acknowledged that Thomas Slater's account was plausible and that it was impossible to know with certainty whether the shooting had been deliberate or accidental. She said that what mattered most to her was that Daniel's death was recognized as a homicide rather than an accident, and that the complex circumstances that had led both families to conceal the truth were understood and documented. Linda and Robert Slater agreed to participate in a joint interview that James would conduct and publish, in which both descendants would discuss their families' histories and their current understanding of the events of 1895. The interview took place at the Kentucky Historical Society, with both families present, and it resulted in a remarkable conversation about memory, truth, forgiveness, and the ways that historical research could help heal old wounds by creating space for multiple perspectives to be heard and respected. The interview was published in a prominent history journal and was widely praised for its thoughtful exploration of how families remember and interpret traumatic events, and how those interpretations can evolve over time as new evidence emerges and as descendants gain distance from the original events. James wrote an accompanying article that analyzed Thomas Slater's journal and discussed the methodological challenges of evaluating conflicting historical accounts when definitive evidence is unavailable. He argued that historians should resist the temptation to declare one account definitively true and another false, and should instead acknowledge ambiguity and complexity when the evidence supports multiple interpretations. He suggested that the Hutchinson-Slater case demonstrated the value of bringing families together to discuss their shared histories, rather than treating historical research as an adversarial process in which one side must be proven right and the other wrong. The article sparked important discussions in the historical profession about how to handle cases where different sources provide conflicting accounts, and it influenced how many historians approached similar situations in their own research. The legacy of James's research on the Hutchinson cabin photograph extended far beyond the specific case of Daniel Hutchinson's death, influencing how historians, archivists, and museum professionals thought about photographic evidence and the process of historical investigation. Universities began incorporating photographic analysis into their history curricula, teaching students the technical skills needed to enhance and examine historical images, as well as the critical thinking skills required to interpret what those images revealed. Professional organizations developed guidelines and best practices for photographic research, emphasizing the importance of combining technical analysis with documentary research and oral history, and stressing the ethical obligations that researchers had to the people whose lives they were investigating. The field of photographic history experienced a renaissance as scholars recognized that millions of historical photographs in archives and private collections had never been systematically examined for the hidden details they might contain. James continued his work for another decade, consulting on projects around the country and training a new generation of photographic historians who would carry forward the methods and approaches he had pioneered. He published a comprehensive textbook on photographic analysis that became the standard reference in the field, and he established a foundation that provided grants to support research projects using photographic evidence to uncover hidden or suppressed aspects of history. The foundation particularly encouraged projects that gave voice to marginalized communities whose experiences had been inadequately documented in official records, and it funded numerous studies that used photographic evidence to document labor conditions, racial violence, environmental destruction, and other subjects that powerful interests had tried to conceal. James took particular satisfaction in seeing young scholars use the techniques he had developed to make discoveries that challenged accepted narratives and that brought attention to injustices that had been forgotten or ignored. The Hutchinson and Slater families maintained their connection over the years, with descendants from both sides participating in regular reunions and collaborative projects to document and preserve their shared history. The families worked together to restore the site of the Hutchinson cabin, which had long since disappeared, but whose location was still identifiable from foundation stones and other archaeological remains. They erected a memorial marker that acknowledged both Daniel Hutchinson's death and the complex circumstances that had led both families to conceal the truth, and they established a small museum in a nearby town where artifacts and documents from both families were displayed, alongside interpretive materials that explained the historical context of frontier justice and conflict resolution. The museum became a popular destination for school groups and tourists, and it served as a model for how communities could acknowledge difficult aspects of their history while honoring the people who had lived through those times. James retired from active consulting work in his early 70s, though he continued to write and to mentor younger scholars who sought his advice on their research projects. He remained in close contact with Linda Hutchinson Brennan and Robert Slater, both of whom had become good friends over the years of working together to document and interpret their families' histories. The three of them occasionally gave joint presentations at conferences and community events, discussing what they had learned from the process of uncovering and sharing difficult truths about the past. They emphasized that historical research was not just an academic exercise, but a deeply human endeavor that could affect real people in profound ways, and that researchers had an obligation to approach their work with humility, empathy, and respect for the complexity of human experience. They argued that the goal of historical research should not be to judge people of the past by contemporary standards, but rather to understand the circumstances they faced and the choices they made, and to learn from their experiences in ways that might help address contemporary challenges. In his final years, James often returned to the Kentucky Historical Society to visit the Stains of History exhibition and to see the Hutchinson cabin photograph that had started him on the journey that had defined the last phase of his career. He would stand in front of the enhanced image showing the dark stain on the cabin porch, and he would think about all the lives that had been touched by the events of April 1895 and by his decision to investigate what that stain represented. He thought about Daniel Hutchinson, whose life had been cut short by violence, and about Thomas Slater, who had lived with guilt and sorrow for the rest of his days. He thought about the families who had made difficult choices in impossible circumstances, and about the descendants who had found ways to acknowledge painful truths while honoring their ancestors' memories. He thought about the power of photographs to preserve evidence across generations, waiting patiently for someone to look closely enough to see what they revealed. and he thought about the responsibility that historians bore to pursue truth with courage and compassion, to give voice to the voiceless, and to help communities understand their pasts in ways that might contribute to building more just and peaceful futures. The stain on the Hutchinson cabin porch had been hidden in plain sight for more than a century, but once revealed, it had opened a window into a world of complexity, tragedy, and ultimately reconciliation that enriched everyone who encountered its story.